everyone, shortly before this video officially kicks off, I just wanted to put at the beginning of this video that by the time you're seeing this video go live, if you're here at the beginning of the video, when it first goes up and running, I will be live streaming Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2 and continuing that campaign. You can listen to this while you watch me use the Necrons to express displeasure through green lightning at their enemies. Then, you can chat about any part of this that I'm currently talking about there if you want. And then also in the description will be a link to Discord. That link will be active for about a week from the time of this video posting. And so if you're interested in being part of my community, we have about, a 70-person server right now. And we'd love to have you as part of it in this growing lore community. So hope to see you there and enjoy this video coming up here. It's going to be a longer one, but has a lot of good stuff and speculation about the end of essentially an era with the Horus Heresy. So here that is, and again, thanks for your time and support. Really appreciate it. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. This is the Darklight Emissary, and today's video is going to be on the End and the Death Part 3, Volume 3, and the final book in the Horus Heresy series that started nearly 20 years ago. And before we dive in on that, I just want to thank each and every one of you again for your support. And if you're new here, I welcome you to possibly subscribe and like and turn on notifications, because many more videos are going to be coming out after this one. And I just invite you to be part of this community that we're building here. It's growing pretty quickly now, and I look forward to meeting some of you and discussing this universe that we love. And completing this series is monumental for me. I first picked up Horus Rising, the first book in this series, nearly 20 years ago by random chance in a Barnes & Noble. As a teenager, I stumbled across it, saw it sitting there, and wasn't sure what it was at first. Didn't realize, that it was starting a whole new series. I was interested, though, because it was about the Horus Heresy, and I was like, oh wait, I've read about that before, and the rest is basically history. I kept on with it every year, got the new releases for books, and so I own all of the Horus Heresy books, minus a couple, basically. And so I've really stuck with it for the long haul, and it's a little bit bittersweet to be coming to an end of this series that has been part of my life for that long. And so each volume that has come out for End and the Death is actually one book total, but Dan Abnett does notate in the final notes for this book that he's just simply, they couldn't bind one book with how many pages there were for trying to wrap up every plot point that are in these books that have, some have started at the beginning all the way to now for some of these characters. So they wanted to do it due diligence and try to really, go out with everything tied up as much as possible, while also leaving some mystery in it. One thing that Dan noted that was a huge mandate from the company, from Game Workshop, was to maintain the mystery overall, not to reveal everything. And so, kind of first off, if you go into this book expecting us to learn every single thing about the Emperor, or learn exactly what he did or didn't do with the Chaos Gods on Moloch, then you're going to be a little bit disappointed here. That being said, I do think that they actually give us some new mysteries that we'll be talking about for the next few years to come, and that might be fleshed out a bit more in future novels. So they're going to keep, feeding us bits, and we'll probably never know everything, but that's part of the fun of this universe, I think, is to think about and speculate and discuss amongst the community what the truth could be, instead of them just giving us a truth and that's that on something. And so I took a fair bit of notes across the book, so I'm going to kind of go over points of the book that I liked and kind of just talk about my thoughts on each part here that I picked up from really liking in the book and thought is relevant for a discussion here in this video, as kind of a partial synopsis and just discussion on topics I found relevant both for the future and for how they decided to wrap up this book and the fight between the Emperor and Horus, and then all the other characters that have been in these books for some since the very beginning book in Horus Rising. This is going to be far from exhaustive on every single thing in this book. I'm sure I missed plenty, so I highly recommend, looking at other people's videos on this subject, because I'm sure each of us that are putting out videos and have put out videos about Part 3 and all the other volumes. Each of us probably noticed different things, and so I highly encourage kind of trying to use us as cross-references, really, because we all probably did our best, and we probably all resonated with different parts of the story than each other. All right, and so I'm going to dive straight into my notes here and discuss each point that I found interesting. So the very first part of this book, up to page 195, page 195 is my first note, and I just wrote the words death lust on this note, and what this is referring to is the Blood Angels, actually, and their reaction to Sanguinius's death. The first part of this book basically starts off with, it's a bit of setup for some of the characters, and it especially sets up the Black Rage, starting with the Blood Angels. And interestingly enough here, the Blood Angels, like, we do get to see some pretty awesome depictions of them just going absolutely insane and tearing apart everything in their paths. I did get a note or a comment from somebody somewhere when I was hoping, I had noted that I was hoping to see the Black Rage happen with the Blood Angels to a great degree. And someone replied to a comment wherever I posted that. I don't remember where I posted it, but anyways, that doesn't matter. Where this person commented saying, I think you're going to be disappointed. As if insinuating they don't really show the Black Rage or show the Blood Angels just destroying and dismembering everything in their paths, but that's not true at all. The Blood Angels, we get to see them in all their terrifying glory here. We watch them fall upon loyalists and traitors and each other. They are just in a complete, just utter rage. And it's pretty awesome. At one point, we have a depiction of Ascalon, who was Sanguinius's chief bodyguard, essentially. And he turns upon one of his Imperial Fist allies. And the Imperial Fist basically feels like he's being stared down by a predator eyeing an antelope. So, kind of imagine that. This being that is a war machine in his own right just sees himself as a prey item for the being in front of him. That's how just vicious Ascalon just is conveying just by staring him down without even really attacking him yet. And so between the traitors that they're still fighting around the palace grounds and trying to fend off Ascalon, this Fist is trying his best not to kill someone who he considers a friend and ally, and has been for the, for the entire siege, and even before that, I imagine, as well. And, he's trying his best not to kill this Blood Angel, and Ascalon is basically getting distracted by other traitors and people showing up to the fight. So eventually he's able to get away from Ascalon, and he's thankfully able to not have to kill him to stop fighting him. But it was unfortunate that happened there. And this is kind of a wider example, or a closer example of a wider issue where the Blood Angels are falling upon everybody everywhere. Basically, just completely overwhelmed. They drop all their weapons. They're fighting with teeth and their bare hands, and just completely just obliterating any aggression, any resistance in their paths, wherever they go, basically. And so we get the first ever depiction of the Black Rage for the Blood Angels, and every single Blood Angel is affected to different degrees. Zephon wasn't as affected as his brothers, but he was still affected, but he was still able to talk, which is interesting compared to Ascalon, Raldoron, and the others. So I don't know what that says about Zephon, but he is able to somewhat resist the Black Rage to a certain degree somehow, and I don't know how he's able to do that. I think he was still elevated in his viciousness, but not quite to the blind degree of the others for whatever reason. It might be due to some kind of injury he sustained earlier on to his psyche or something. I'm not entirely sure there. And so the next note I have here is for page 223. I just noted down L2 and Erda, Eldar connection. And so this is speaking about LE2 or Li2, as he's kind of depicted by name in the books. L2 is one of the first Space Marines to ever exist, if not the first one. And he's been part of the Long Companions with like Alanius and John and the rest of them sent by Erda, who he was basically the personal bodyguard to assist him on their journey. And L2 just mentions in a musing, in an observation here, that, like he had been on a weird, unexpected journey once with Erda and seen Eldari dancers and like harlequins and things. And so I just put this connection there, like, what did Erda know about the Eldar, or like what was her relationship with them? And we know that, Eldrad knew the Emperor to some degree, and that they were somewhat allies as well. So apparently Erda was too, or Erda had some kind of relationship or connections with Eldari for, years before the Great Crusade, possibly hundreds of years before that. Who knows? It doesn't say much more than this, but I thought it was just an interesting tidbit that is just kind of in passing here that L2 is thinking about. And before I continue with these notes, I do want to jump back towards the beginning of the book, because there was a couple things I didn't note down, and I just realized that I just want to point out. They're just quick things, and they're things that I really liked, though, and just kind of more like feats of the Emperor type of thing. So the very beginning of this book does kind of set up like the Emperor, Loken, and Leetu, and the remaining custody with them. They're traveling through the inevitable city to get to Horus still, and the beginning of the book just has them traveling through the wastes and confronting a couple challenges. One of the challenges that they confront is a gigantic chaos beast of some kind. It's this massive, monstrous, just enormous demon of some kind, and the Emperor basically does it like a God of War impression and like jumps up onto the top of this beast, stabs his sword into it. And while he's fighting that beast, Leetu and Loken and the Custodia are basically fighting off piles of demons trying to, get at them, while the Emperor's dealing with the big one. And basically the Emperor's channeling some of his might through them, so like their weapons are slaying demons while he's slaying this giant one. And the Emperor like kills this gigantic demon that would probably be a centerpiece fight in anything else in a couple of minutes, and then just keeps moving on like it was nothing, because they're trying their best to get to Horus pretty quickly. So that's where we kind of start off, is with that. And then the Emperor and the rest of them come across a company or two, quite a few word bearers. And these word bearers and tanks and dreadnoughts are arrayed against them, facing them. And then they're blocking the entrance to some kind of entryway that will eventually take them to Horus. And the Emperor just basically projects like a very powerful lightning spell that just flies forward and like just obliterates all of them in one go, essentially. They don't even lift their swords in fighting any of these Space Marines. The Emperor one-shots them, which is appropriate. I would expect the Emperor to be capable of those kind of feats. It would be kind of silly if the Emperor had to lift his sword at all in a fight against a Space Marine. So it was pretty funny just to watch them get obliterated. And before that happens, L2 just says, "We can take them." And the Emperor responds psychically, "We can." And then he does that and just completely uses his psyker abilities to just completely own these guys. And it was just a great feat to behold the Emperor do. And so then they enter this like building entryway, and when they get inside this building, they are basically getting confined to like some very tight kind of corridors and stuff, and they eventually end up in a chasm. And this chasm is basically becoming too tight from the walk straight through, and the Emperor is, at this point in this aspect, much bigger than the Space Marines, but even they are starting to get tightened by the sides of this chasm. And so the Emperor hands one of them his sword, or hands it to the custodian. Then he just reaches his arms on the to each side of the chasm and pushes, and he's able to push the chasm wider, because they're in the warp now. Everything's in the warp, and the Emperor is a master of the warp, almost as much as the Chaos Gods to some degrees. And so he's like, "Don't have the time for this, and these weird trials that you're messing with. I'm just going to push the sides of this chasm away." And so he pushes them so that they have more room to get to Horus quicker as they're approaching the court of Horus that he has set up waiting for them. And then eventually they do get to the court of Horus, and Horus at first isn't here. He isn't visible, at least. And the first thing they see is Sanguinius's body. Now, Sanguinius has been nailed to the wall by a whole bunch of like black iron spikes, essentially. So the Emperor, instructs for them to, pull him down. So Leto and Loken go over and start pulling him down frantically off the wall and trying to just, get this dishonor being done to Sanguinius's, what's left of him, undone. And while they're doing that, it says that to mark Horus's arrival, it says that they hear Horus smile. They don't see him smile. They can feel that he's smiling at them. And then he kind of like comes out of like fractal patterns, like petals of a flower, almost like out of like the black marble, the black rock of the court that he has set up to see them in. Now, one of the interesting things to just note about any parts of this book in general with Horus in it, everything in Horus is in second person. It's describing as like, like you are doing this now. You are doing this now. This is how you feel now. And so it's either Horus absorbing this about himself in the second person, but Dan Abnett does note at the end, in his notes for this book, just who is talking to Horus here, who is narrating that, suggesting that it's not Horus. And he's basically asking who would be the one narrating for Horus at this point. And we'll talk a little bit about that in speculation near the end of this video. And one interesting thing of note here is, as much as Horus is a puppet of the Chaos Gods right now, he does not seem to notice that at all. He feels like he's in complete control. And then on top of that, he really does not want to outright kill the Emperor initially. And he even expresses a bit of regret in having to fight the Emperor at this point, is kind of the observation being given. That he would prefer for the Emperor to rule at his side and to not have to just depose his father. So it just kind of goes to show that Horus still has feelings for the Emperor, even if a lot of those feelings have curdled into, anger and hatred and being clouded by the Chaos Gods, essentially. But, he's far from just simply mustache twirling here and, my evil plans, that sort of thing. That's all basically reserved for Erebus still, and don't worry, we'll get to that eternal cockroach later on. But Horus comes across a little bit more, a bit more somber about things, despite, being ascendant here. And it's interesting. The Emperor's talking to, not the Emperor, Horus is talking to the Emperor here at the beginning, basically saying, like, you're here now, you should join me, trying to talk to his father. But then Loken and L2 and the Custodial take turns kind of talking to Horus too here. And when Horus notices Loken there, he's like, what are you doing here, Loken? I don't want you to see this going on. Like, he still has a lot of love for Loken, which is interesting. He acts almost like he never tried to have Loken killed, back all the way back on Istvan 3 in the culling of his legion. It might just be him being blinded by, the Chaos Gods here in some way, where, just the sentimentality is left for Loken. I'm not sure. But he's both, throughout this story, in this book, he's both unwilling to just instantly kill Loken or otherwise harm him, really. He doesn't want to. In fact, I think he still wants, Loken to serve him and be on his side. He did depict Loken as his Sanguinius in one of the other End in the Death novels. So he definitely holds Loken in high regard, and still to this point, even where he is at, not wanting to hurt Loken. And so Horus starts asking the Emperor different questions and things, like asking him, like, what are you, I want you to join me and things like that. And the Emperor just starts asking the question, why, psychically. And Horus starts asking questions in return, like, what do you mean, why? Like, why are we at war? Why did Sanguinius have to be killed? Like, what do you mean, why? Are you in shock, father? That's the kind of things Horus is asking. And then he realizes that the Emperor is looking past him. not at him. And Horus realizes that he's looking behind him. And Horus also looks behind him, and he actually sees the 4 chaos gods, and they're nearly fully manifested as gods here, like in their full forms. And it just says that they're, like, in Horus's perspective, he just calls them huge and magnificent and beautiful, basically, standing there observing this fight. So the chaos gods are in full attendance, in a way, in a manifestation we have never seen before in nearly any novel, I would say, to this degree. And of note here, kind of related to this a little bit later on, when the fighting starts, L2, Leetu, he gets thrown by Horus out of the way, essentially. And Leetu actually lands basically in the realm of chaos, which they're already in it, but like he lands more in it, I would say. He lands basically near the foot of a chaos god. He just sees a gigantic talon, and he like realizes it's like a foot that he's nearby, and he looks up, and he just like 1,000 feet up in the air, he sees a head turn and look down at him with indifference, really. And he realizes that there's also like the head of a giant axe resting on the ground, not far away from him. So it seems like he is seeing Khorne's axe on the ground, resting on the ground next to Khorne. And then I assume he's landing right next to a depiction of Tzeentch that looks down at him, that the talon is possibly a bird claw of Tzeentch as a gigantic Lord of Change depicted. And so it's just an interesting side note, and it ends the chapter with Leetu seeing this, and it just says, as a last sentence, that there wasn't even a point in screaming about this. The situation was so preposterously insane, crazy, deadly, all of the above, that Leetu was just like, yeah, I've got nothing for this emotionally. I don't know, what I'm gonna, like, he just accepted it fully. It's like, what can you do in the face of literally 4 gods just looking at you, essentially. And that's where we leave L2 for a little bit there. And so we get this question of why from the Emperor, and it's directed at the Chaos Gods, though, not at Horus and his actions, but at them. And so Horus, basically is just like, you're going to pay attention to me, and starts attacking the Emperor with some kind of psychic lightning. And so the fight basically starts with that, and the Emperor at first is basically just tanking shots. And this is when L2, Loken, and the remaining Custody, Dusk, come at the Horus and basically distract him a little bit for the Emperor to kind of recover here and get into an actual fight with Horus at this point. And so I want to speculate for a minute here on the why question. I noted down, like, why would the Emperor ask why to the Chaos Gods here? Shouldn't he know why by now? Like, we know that there are eternal enemies, that it seems like the Emperor and the Chaos Gods have been essentially at war, or at least indifferent, or at least not on the same side ever. But the question of why seems to indicate that the Emperor did not expect them to attack him, or corrupt his men, or ruin his plans. So, did they have some kind of truce that the Emperor feels like they, betrayed him on before he was going to betray them on? Because essentially, we know that the Emperor went to Molech and took something from chaos, the realm of chaos there, either power or secrets from the Chaos Gods. But it seemed like possibly that it was a deal struck with the Chaos Gods more so than just the Emperor stealing it. And if that's the case, then perhaps the Chaos Gods at first were allowing the Emperor to take some of that power, and that the Emperor was kind of surprised that, they chose to betray him when they did. Maybe he did expect that to happen from Chaos, but maybe not at that time, which is why he's asking why. I'm not sure. It's very interesting that that's what he opens with, is just asking the question, why would you, kill my son, which is Horus. He's talking about not even Sanguinius here. But then, why is he so surprised that the Chaos Gods would both do that and betray not betray him, but attack him, with what they are by nature. It's just interesting. I don't really know what that means. And this is kind of one of the mysteries that they kind of inject between the relationship of the Emperor and the Chaos Gods. It's not quite just a purely diametric opposition. The Emperor seems to be not surprised per se, but still asking, why did you do this? What was the point? Almost is what he's asking. Or why did you do it at this time? I'm not sure exactly all the context of that question. It's interesting how that one single question from the Emperor can spawn so much speculation and thought into, what's going on in the Emperor's mind here and how he's choosing to first communicate with the Chaos Gods here. And so then we really get into the fighting in earnest. We basically have a lot of clashing of the weapons of the Emperor's sword, the talons of Horus, the World Breaker Maul that Horus has, the Emperor's lightning claw, and basically the fighting is so rapid here that it's essentially a Dragon Ball Z match. If you've ever watched Dragon Ball Z, you have the characters punching each other super fast. Some of the scenes, this is what this almost looks like, the way that L2 is describing it, watching it. L2 wants to do something to help the Emperor, but he knows he can't come between the two combatants. They're just moving that fast. They're basically just a hurricane blur moving in circles around the court at the beginning of this fight, just trading physical blows, trying to break through each other's shielding, both psychic and physical that they have, trying to get through their armor. And both of them are scoring glancing blows at this point, but not really getting anywhere with the fight other than just kind of trading blows with each other. And you're going to have to forgive me as I start explaining and summarizing this fight, because it's almost a heretical notion to summarize the fight as bonkers as this fight is, but without reading the whole thing to you, I can't really do that to explain it, to do it justice. If you have not read this book, I highly recommend it for the fight between the Emperor and Horus, because it's just really bonkers fun. At the end of the day, it's a really good depiction. But I will warn you, the way I'm going to summarize it makes it sound possibly a little more silly than it actually is depicted in the book. But there's great detail given into basically every action in the book itself. So take what I say here in summarization as a grain of thought here. And so eventually the fight goes from a physical one to more of a psychic fight where they're fighting mentally as well as physically. And they start fighting with memories, essentially. They start fighting by moving through time and space to different points of time and space, and they seem to be literally going to different places. So one of the places the Emperor takes Horus is to Chthoniya, his homeworld, and they're fighting back during the era that Horus actually was living on Chthoniya. And so he takes him back there to kind of try to put Horus off of his game a bit and kind of shock him by bringing him back to his homeworld. And so they get into a bit of fighting there. And then they're transported through space and time to the Himalayas, back in time when it was just the Himalayas. So they're fighting on steep snowbanks and causing avalanches and things on the side of that mountain. And they transport themselves to Istvan 5 and are fighting there. And one of the really funny things was the Emperor, at one point they teleport to a planet where there's an orc war going on. And the Emperor sends an orc war at Horus, so there's an army of orcs getting psychically goaded by the Emperor into charging Horus, which I just find really funny. And likewise, when they're on Chthoniya, Horus is sending Chthonian gangers at the Emperor, so they're basically using small armies against each other at one point during this fight. And eventually they end up on Molech, and when they're on Molech, Horus muses about observing what the Emperor did there. And he mentions that he says that solemn promises were made there, secret flame was stolen, and that then the Emperor told nothing to his sons about any of that. And Horus finds that ultimately unreasonable. So kind of going back to, this is related to, I think, the Emperor saying why to the Chaos Gods. What were these solemn promises made? What was the flame that was stolen? Like, it's still left vague, and this book does not answer it, which I think is a purposeful thing to maintain the mystery. But what were the promises made? By the Emperor's question of why, I think we can think that it's possible that some of the solemn promises made were by the Chaos Gods, and that the Chaos Gods betrayed the Emperor, and that for whatever reason, the nature of these promises held more weight than normally what you would think with a Chaos God, which is, yeah, all four of the Chaos Gods are kind of naturally deceptive, even Khorne to a degree, just by the nature of being part of Chaos. So what kind of promises could be made with the Chaos Gods that the Emperor expected them to uphold? And by asking that question of why, it insinuates the Chaos Gods were the first to break this promise. But then the Secret Flame being stolen by the Emperor, maybe that is why they betrayed the Emperor with whatever secrets they gave him. It's left unclear here. But still, the Emperor's question of why seems to indicate that either he did not realize he stole a flame from the Chaos Gods, or that it was given and later considered stolen by the Chaos Gods. Something like that, maybe. But again, kind of just my speculation on what these lines really mean here. And so on Moloch, eventually Horus starts beating the Emperor on this world, and then Horus has a move called Bloodlight he uses, where he basically shoots a bright red beam out of the eye on his armor, and he manages to spear the Emperor on it, and then the Emperor, like, basically evaporates here. And so you're like, okay, there's no way Horus actually defeated the Emperor right here, so what's happening here? And so then, from this fight, you realize that it starts opening up, and this version of Horus sees a version of himself fighting the Emperor on dozens of different planes of existence, and basically, this is like their mental fight. And there's shards of both the Emperor and Horus essentially fighting and winning or losing different parts of that part of the battle, while they're also physically fighting each other. And so it's just interesting how they're opening up this fight and showing different layers of this fight happening, from the physical to the psychic, and then later on to even more esoteric ways that they fight. And just kind of a side note that was funny was, at one point, Horus and the Emperor end up on Earth early on near a hive city, and it's depicted that some of the people actually see them fighting outside. So just imagine for like a couple of minutes, you see two demigods just fighting each other, and you have no idea who they are or what they're doing out there. They just show up. Just thought that was kind of funny that, some normal people living in the city just, look outside its walls and see this happening for a few minutes outside of their probably normal menial existences. They get to see something that, isn't going to happen for potentially thousands of years from the time that they're seeing it. And so for a few minutes here, we're going to depart from the Emperor and Horus while they're in the middle of this battle of wits, essentially psychically, in their minds. And we're going to go back to Rogal Dorn and Constantine Valder. So we haven't talked about them yet, and essentially 20 minutes after Valdor appeared on the Vengeful Spirit, they have just now reached a fight with Abaddon and the first company of the Sons of Horus. And so the remaining custodies with Valdor are on their way to try to fight Abaddon, essentially, and take him down. And so they are fighting their way up the remains of one of the orbital plates, space stations that was on Terra. And essentially, Valder proves himself to be, I would imagine, even more than just a custode here. He is just on a different level. He's getting pummeled by 3 different Cataphracti Terminators of the first company, Justarin, Sons of Horus. And they're punching him. They have a sword impaled in his side. And he's still fighting them somehow. That's what's crazy. Like, he's able to punch back at them and is still somewhat fighting them. They do eventually call off their fight against Valder because Abaddon calls them back so they can get some kind of trap in place to try to really defeat all the custodies, plus more custodians were on the way to help Valdor in this moment. So, but it's just ridiculous. Valdor is just the ultimate tank here, and he still is able to walk after this somehow. Like, it just shows that Valdor is built of something different, even for a custody. He might as well be at a Primarch level, and this kind of proves it to me that he might as well be. And so eventually, we get a little bit of POV from Erebus and Abaddon, who are together at this point. And Erebus basically tells Abaddon, embrace the gifts of chaos. You have been resisting it this entire time. Because throughout the entire war, Abaddon has hated chaos. And so our favorite eternal cockroach, Erebus, basically is like, embrace the dark side here, doing his best Palpatine impression, I imagine, to Anakin, so to speak. And Abaddon finally kind of acquiesces and is like, okay, if it'll help me fight as a tool to fight, I'll use it. And so, Valdor's approaching, trying to get to them still in a fight, and they're expecting a trap of some kind. But the sky tears open above them, and Abaddon drops out of the tear in the sky and lands right in front of Valdor. Valdor swings his spear at him, and Abaddon is able to grab the edge of the spear and stop it. And it just completely surprises Valdor because the strength behind that hit. If we're going off of Valdor presumably being near Primarch strength, or at that strength, Abaddon stopped it cold, which shouldn't be possible as an Astartes, even as vicious as Abaddon has proven to be. And since the spear is able to basically give Valdor truth and revelation for whatever it's making contact with, he sees essentially Abaddon's future as the despoiler, and sees that, he's going to ignite the galaxy in flames later on as that despoiler. And so this kind of insinuates that Valdor, we know that Valdor's possibly the King in Yellow in the Beckwin trilogy, all the way in the 41st millennium. So, and it would make sense that Valdor possibly was prepping for this eventuality that he saw by connecting with Abaddon and seeing essentially what's going to happen in the future at this point. And Constantine realizes that the future is only war, essentially. And he even utters the word despoiler to Abaddon, essentially. And just realizes that there's not a good future ahead. And so they get into a brief fight. Abaddon takes a punch by Valdor on the face and remains standing. But the fight is short-lived, and the very ground that they're on starts turning and becoming a wall, and then becoming the ceiling. And so all the custodies in Valdor, start falling, and towards the sky they start falling. And they're all holding on to different bits and pieces of landscape, trying not to fall into what is now basically a bottomless pit, essentially this roiling, warp-fueled sky. And the Justarin are just casually basically decapitating all of the members of Valdor's party as much as they can. And it's not a good time, as usual, for Valdor and his group. I mean, through this entire 3-volume series, Valdor and his guys, his group of custodies, have just been utterly manhandled. Like, they just can't get a one-up anywhere. Like, they were kept out of the fight for good reason, for basically all of it. But, man, the method by how they got kicked out of the fight, compared to, like, Rogal Dorn, or any of them, just so harsh. Like, I honestly felt bad for Valdor. As much as Valdor and the custodies have kind of shown themselves to be kind of colossal assholes ultimately, like, it's still just I just feel bad for him here. Like, they wanted to be by the Emperor's side, and help him, and they just got bogged down at every single turn. They couldn't even fight these Space Marines effectively because of what Erebus is doing. And so Valdor eventually wakes up and he's back on the ground. The sky apparently didn't stay inverted for long, and he's laying on the ground. And there's a couple of custodies alive with him, and they're able to kind of regather themselves a bit. But they're getting surrounded by the remaining Justarin, along with some word bearers, and they're basically going to have a final stand losing fight against the rest of Abaddon's forces here. And then, coming out of nowhere, essentially, we have Rogal Dorn, and he just plows through the traitors and reaches Valdor and is essentially like, I'm here to help you. And Dorn at this point has not fought anybody. He has just barely broken free of his prison, where, Khorne basically tried to corrupt him to his side for, essentially some kind of eternity, at least thousands of years. At least that's how Rogal Dorn felt it took. And so Dorn is fresh, essentially, and is able to help them to a great degree to kind of break free of the cordon around them that's happening. Although Constantine is basically just like, you've just come here to die with us, essentially. And Dorn's like, I don't see a better option. I would rather die by you than not do anything, essentially, is what Dorn is saying here. And I do want to talk about Rogal Dorn for a minute here, and we'll talk about him a little bit more a little bit later as well. But essentially, Rogal Dorn has been changed quite a bit by his ordeal, but he's kind of tempered now, he's less harsh in his overall demeanor. He's a bit more kind, oddly enough. He just comes across like it really shifted his attitude on things a bit, in I think some good ways right now, at least. This might change after, if we see him during the scouring, but as of right now, Dorn seems almost wiser than he was, which is interesting, from his challenge that he overcame and, not falling to chaos on his own. Eventually, Dorn and Constantine are able to break free of the cordon, and they start making their way towards a central maelstrom, which they assume, it turns out correctly, is where the fight between Horus and the Emperor is happening. And so they're able to break free of the fighting, leaving some of the custodies behind to continue fighting the rest of Abaddon's forces, and with orders to try to reach the same point as Constantine and Dorn are heading to. And so they're essentially climbing up a mountainscape to reach where the maelstrom is, and Valdor is somehow able to do it, despite being how injured he is at this point. And, Dorn is, reaching out a hand to him and stuff, and really trying to be, again, kind to Constantine, essentially. And Constantine's having none of it. Constantine's just completely angry at this point. Wants none of Dorn's mercy or anything at all. He's like, I can keep going, let's keep going. And, Rogal Dorn is not the type of guy to, tell somebody to, rest, essentially. He's like, you should tough it up, is what Dorn would normally really say. But he sees how injured Valdor is and is like, you should rest. And Valdor is like, I am not resting. We need to keep going. And it's just interesting to see Dorn, of all people, telling someone, hey, you don't look so good. Instead of saying, shrug it off, rub some dirt in it. Because that's kind of what old Dorn would have done, I felt like, even at this point. And instead, he's trying to be almost reassuring to Constantine, despite the bristly nature of the chief custody right now. Eventually, Dorn and Constantine get closer to the maelstrom, and they come across a very tall, giant demon of some kind, and they have a fight against it. And Dorn is essentially taking the bulk of the distraction and fighting first, because Valdor's in no condition to be running or jumping or anything right now. And so Dorn basically gets close and is able to land some hits on this demon. And then Valdor's able to basically take it out by throwing his spear over and through the demon and bringing it down that way. So he still contributes to the fight, helping to completely defeat the demon that way. Learns the demon's name through the spear and, casts the demon out, essentially. And so then they continue onwards. And we have kind of an interesting moment here. We have kind of the beginnings of a bond between these two starting in a sense. They both kind of bond over Sanguinius' death to a degree. Basically, Constantine says, he really didn't like any of the Primarchs, but he couldn't help but like Sanguinius. And, he's sad that it seems that Sanguinius is gone. Oh, and I should mention one important thing I did forget here. I'll just kind of backtrack a minute here. One of the reasons they were able to break free of the cordon against Abaddon and them is the remains of Raldoron and the Blood Angels show up in mass and are in the midst of their Black Rage, and they just completely fall upon the Word Bearers and Sons of Horus, and so Abaddon has to turn and fight them off essentially, and so that fight just becomes a savage brawl essentially, and turns into a distraction point for Valder and Dorn to disengage effectively. And so Constantine gets vulnerable here for Constantine's on Constantine's level, I would say. He's still not vulnerable per se, but he does say to, Dorn, Dorn expresses that he wants to be the one to take down Horus, and Valder says, he doesn't know what it's like to actually have a brother, and that he should be the one so that Dorn doesn't have to have that on his conscience. So it just shows them kind of, they've been fighting a long time next to each other, but I don't think they've ever really had time to talk, and so they're kind of having the beginnings of a connection here. And so I really think, this is my speculation, that if Valder is truly the King in Yellow in the Beckwin trilogy, I do wonder if, along with Valder being back as a twist, if another twist is going to be that Rogal Dorn is helping him and will arrive too. That they both disappeared together to undertake the same sort of task. This was a theory I had a while ago in a previous video. I'll put that video here. Essentially, it's just, like with them having kind of a bond from the shared experience of both failing the Emperor in a similar way, not being present for the fight at all. I could see them leaving together at the same time as well to try to enact some kind of final ploy to get the Emperor back. And one word I put in my notes that shows up several times during the fight with Horus and the Emperor is, it's spelled Y-L-E-M, and it's pronounced as Ilum. And essentially what this word means is that it's meant to be the primordial matter of the universe, originally conceived as composed of neutrons at high temperature and density. And it just keeps mentioning like this as a nature of like part of the material from the fight happening between Horus and the Emperor, essentially just talking about the Emperor's makeup, like part of what his makeup is that ancient. It insinuates that, at least, which it's used several times throughout this fight, which I found interesting. And then I just wrote down one of my favorite lines from this fight. As the fight gets weirder between the Emperor and Horus, there's a line that just says, "Distance and dimension start to twist along disturbing planes," which I just found that interesting. And this is right around the time that L2 gets thrown at the foot of the Chaos Gods and presumably makes eye contact with Zench, which, just that alone, like, just imagine making eye contact with a god that is basically depicted by insanity to a large degree. And so someone we have not talked about really yet, other than to mention his name, is Sigismund. So while all this is going on, Sigismund and Euphrates Keeler and the remaining population from the palace has been traveling in some kind of desert plain. And they eventually run across a group of Death Guard, and they get into a fight with them. The leader of this Death Guard is wielding some kind of sword that basically just instantly decays any armor it goes through. So the only thing that Sigismund is able to do is to use his black sword to block the attacks. Like, the sword is the only thing that resists the attack. But then even then, Sigismund feels pain radiating down him just from making contact with that blade during this fight. And eventually what ends up happening is, they're able to defeat the Death Guard here, essentially, when the pilgrims, all the people, start marching in rows of just endless tide of humanity at the Death Guard, and the Death Guard are kind of confused by this. They're like not expecting regular people to get into this fighting at all, and Sigismund's forces were losing at the time, so this helped them distract the Death Guard and get the advantage on them again and fight them. And so they continue up a canyon, essentially, and the canyon starts turning into a mountain. And essentially, through following Euphrates and her the feeling from the Emperor, essentially, or her faith at least, they end up at the Astronomicon, and they make contact with the Dark Angels there. So Corswain, Cypher, and their forces currently fighting the Death Guard and trying to bring the Astronomicon back online still. And so Sigismund lends his blade and forces to shore up the defenses against the endless tide of Death Guard forces that are just continuously climbing up sheer cliffs and coming at them like inevitable waves, essentially eroding ashore. Like, they're just very merciless, very Death Guard, where they're just trying to fight by attrition against their enemy forces, using their, disease forms to shrug off attacks and pain and fighting, and just sending endless warriors essentially at them at the command of Typhon, or Typhus as he's now known. And I just put a note here that Sigismund muses on fearing for the future in general, with, just constant fighting happening. Like, he's kind of seeing that, if they make it out of this, the future is only war as well. Even without a spear like Valder, he just kind of knows that, the future is going to be a rough one during this fighting at the Astronomicon area. And so we're going to go back to the Emperor and Horus now, and the fight is basically, at this point, Horus has subdued the Emperor to some degree physically, and at this point, Horus wants to drag the Emperor to a throne and try to still corrupt the Emperor, essentially, is what he wants. He's coaching it as, wanting to reward his father still after everything, but really it's essentially to just become a slave to chaos like him. And Horus fashions out of bloodlight a 8-pointed crown, a crown of chaos, as he calls it. And he has put the Emperor in the throne that he had made for him, and he, turns to put the crown on him, and the Emperor is no longer in that throne anymore. And it should be noted by this point in the fight that a lot has already happened, and I apologize, but I'm not going to be able to summarize every bit that happens in this fight. A lot happens. I want to share everything with you, but I'm simply not going to be able to do it complete justice. But essentially, at one point, the Emperor is able to blast Horus with psychic eye power. Like, he is able to blast white flames from his eyes, essentially, and it says that Horus was thrown across infinite dimensions, and his soul was split in two by the force of that attack. They attack each other with rune magic, so essentially the Emperor uses sigillite magic that essentially he might have learned from Malkador, and he's drawing symbols in the air with his fingers that he's able to throw and physically hit Horus with, which is interesting. And Horus is like, sigillite magic's weak, why are you trying to do that against me? Eventually Horus is able to grab the physical runes that are created, and he actually runs them through the Emperor and pins him to the throne that he has him in. And then the last custody that was thrown away during this fight, thrown off, the two Space Marines, Loken and Litu, he shows back up here, and he has his own little final stand against Horus, standing in front of the Emperor, and is essentially saying, by his will, I defy you, type of thing. And so Horus essentially just obliterates the custody with bloodlight power at this point. But before this happens, the Emperor starts trying to speak to Horus through the custody, like he has done several times in these novels where he speaks directly through the custodies. He says, my son, you are being deceived, by, you've been tricked. And Horus cuts him off and is like, no, you're the deceiver, and then obliterates the custody with the bloodlight, essentially. Although he still remains standing for a time, because this custody was marked by the sigillite with a symbol on his chest plate that seems to have protected him both in the past as well as now to a great degree. And so he's still standing for a little while. And due to this distraction, Litu is able to get to the throne and pull the runes out of the Emperor and let him get back up to try to fight Horus some more. And that is when Litu gets thrown to the Chaos Gods, essentially at their feet, which was, an interesting point. I think Litu is one of the only beings to ever see a Chaos God that close. Other than a greater demon at the throne of Khorne, or, you know, a Lord of Change being thrown into the Well of Eternity by Zench, no one really gets to see a Chaos God and live, which we'll get into that later, but L2 does survive this encounter by some impossibility here. And so the Emperor is up and swinging a little bit again. He's using one of the runes as kind of like a blade weapon, but he's just kind of staggering. And one of the injuries that he sustained at this point is one of his arms got completely degloved by Horus. So he is somehow operating an arm without, basically shredded to the bone. His right arm is basically shredded. And he's kind of just stumbling, kind of lurching towards Horus, trying to swing the rune at him, essentially. Eventually, Horus is able to subdue the Emperor again, and the Emperor is breathing heavily, laying on the ground, basically spent. Horus kneels down to pick the Emperor up to take him back to the throne, and the Emperor pulls his arm out from under him, and he has the blood-light crown in his hands, and he smashes that across a face of Horus, and basically splits him to his skull, it says. Like, splits his skull open with the sharp points of this crown of chaos. Horus recovers from this pretty quick. He regrows the everything back, basically regenerates, because his power is so ascendant at this point. And he uses his might to pull the thrones towards the Emperor and basically buries the Emperor in the rubble of one of the thrones. And it just mentions that basically the debris from the throne breaking, each of the large pieces of it are like 1,000 tons each. So the Emperor is essentially buried underneath these and is not doing so well at this point. He's essentially unconscious right now. Now, two important characters we have not talked about yet, but become important right now at this point in the story, is Alanius and John Grammaticus. So, one of the things that the Emperor did is he healed up their wounds and everything when they first met with Alanius and John. And one of the things that the Emperor also either meant to or inadvertently healed up was the Athame dagger that he had. And this dagger has been used throughout the stories to cut open tears in reality, essentially. If you do it right, you can travel through different points in time. And they use this newly regenerated, formerly shattered dagger to reach the Emperor's side to give him this blade. Alanius senses that he needs to get it to him. And so they open up a tear, and they end up right here at this point in time where the Emperor is deposed. And they look up from a tear right into the face of Horus. They basically land right at Horus's feet. And it says that Horus feels sorry for them, essentially. And even Horus looks a little bit bewildered and taken aback by this turn of events. He's like, what are you two doing here? Like, what is up with this? And, he goes to basically just kill them very quickly. He basically just starts swinging the talons of Horus at them. And one of the things I like about this part is that it just depicts the blades on the talons as blades long as the light and lightless as old night. I just like that depiction. And it also says that, the War Master Horus is, a monster, just this giant shape cut out of the Empyrean's blackest cloth. And it just says, it is malice incarnate. It is the void in a titanic humanoid shape. So just, they're seeing, Horus so ascendant and gorged with power, he, looks like that, essentially. And so the only way that they are able to fight this at this point is John uses the word from Eununcia that he had learned from Alanius previously, and that Alanius had used all the way back at the Tower of Babel times to stop the Emperor from claiming the power of Eununcia. And this word, I just noted it as the word that never was, because every time it's uttered in any of these books, it's not uttered at all. It's just like a blank spot on the page, or like an underscore with like slash marks depicting that this word was spoken. And it's just described as sound ceasing. There's a silent concussion that implodes the world, and that Alanius feels gravity crush him into paste, and that there's nothingness. And then eventually he wakes back up to John shaking him awake, and this Ununcia word did so much damage that Horus is actually laying on the ground with his warplate cracked, and he's not moving at all. And so John's like, come on, we gotta, keep moving here. He's gonna come back soon. And so eventually Alanius wakes back up completely, basically tells John, hey, you still need to tie the threads going back through time, or we'll never make it here, just like we'd spoken about. And Alanius is like, I'm staying here. I need to give this blade to the Emperor. And so this is where John and Alanius part, and they never see each other again, it says. And so Alanius is near the Emperor, and the Emperor is completely covered in the chalky remains of the throne, and he's trying to wake the Emperor up, essentially, from unconsciousness, and all the time he's using to wake up the Emperor and give him that blade, Horus starts stirring. And then Horus eventually recovers and wakes up and marches his way over to the throne. And Alanius makes a glorious last stand in front of Horus. He has his las gun with him. He stoically stands there and shoots a few shots at Horus. And then Horus just sweeps the talon of Horus down and basically just turns Alanius into red mist. And so Alanius goes down after a very long life, protecting his former assumed best friend, the Emperor here. And so that's where we get the myth of Alanius, the final guardsman that was at this fight, which happened to also be the original War Master for the Emperor all the way back in time during the Tower of Babel era. And again, I'm going to apologize for some of the order of this video. Some of it's going to be a little bit out of order from the book, but I'm just kind of going across things that I liked from the book at this point. One thing I did not bring up that I apparently did not notate down until now was that one of the main ways that the Emperor and Horus fight earlier, before it gets to this point, is they essentially have a card fight, like unto Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic the Gathering. And it sounds silly the way I'm describing it, but it's given a appropriate level of gravitas. They both have a tarot card deck, and they're basically using them as like symbols to like batter each other's defenses down. And like each symbol that they play from the cards counteracts the one that the other one's using. So, the Emperor is using his tarots, and Horus has his own version of tarot cards as well. One labeled like Despoiler, things like that. And that's kind of one of the final ways that Horus uses to batter down the Emperor's defenses, is through this essentially battle of wills through these cards, which I did find pretty fun. Like it just shows that they're fighting on like a level that no one else can fight on. They're fighting on a physical level, emotional, psychic, esoteric, like any way you can think of. The Emperor and Horus basically were fighting in every possible conceivable way that two beings can fight each other in a battle, fight each other in a one-on-one fight between beings that are larger than mortal life, essentially. They chase each other through realms of chaos. They they pursue each other for a long time and get into some major fights against each other in a myriad of different ways, some of which I've chronicled. I'm sure I'm missing some of it, but again, I mean, Dan Abnett says that the main fight sequence between Horus and the Emperor in this book is the longest chapter, so I really can't do it justice. And again, if you have not read this, really I'm trying to give a decent summary of it for you, but really you need to read it for yourself if you really want to see how it really feels and is depicted in the way it was written by Dan and the work he put into it, essentially. So next note I have here is about Corswain and the fight that they're currently having still against the Death Guard in the Astronomicon. It mentions that Corswain's blade is chipped basically at this point to the point of looking serrated, just from the sheer attrition of hacking down endless Death Guard Marines that are pushing against the unyielding wall of the Dark Angels. A wall that's unyielding, but slowly buckling, essentially. Even with the support of someone like Sigismund, with his, as of yet, unblemished Black Blade and his skill, it's not enough, and they know that, they're fighting on borrowed time, essentially. And their ultimate goal right now is to try to light the Astronomicon, and they have a way they can possibly do that using the faith of the last few million citizens from the palace that have gotten to this point with Sigismund and Euphrates. And Euphrates is leading them in a focal point of basically chanting that the Emperor must live. And then the last 3 remaining librarians of the Dark Angels are essentially trying to start a spark with their powers to get the Astronomicon going. And they're able to do that, and the focal point is able to essentially ignite, and a gigantic beam of basically pure psionic light shoots up out of the mountain and reignites the Astronomicon. It incinerates ships up in orbit above it and causes others circuits to fry, and Typhus and his forces are essentially pushed back by the purity of this power, and avalanches and things bring down Dark Angels and Death Guard alike into chasms and all around the mountain. And so with that, the Astronomicon is relit. It gets seen all the way at the palace, and at the palace it breaks the fog of red that is hazing everything. They just see this bright, white beam of light, and then it seems to fade for a minute, and the loyalists are worried for a slight minute, but then the power of the light returns 1,000-fold and just literally starts blasting away, essentially. The chaos form of the warp starts clearing things up, allows for time to start moving again, essentially. And so then we have a decently long talk between Loken and Horus. There's an argument between the two of them. Horus still doesn't want to kill his son. He threatens several times here, and Loken is basically confronting him about, the power he's wielding, appealing to Horus's former honorable nature, to different degrees. Basically, saying that, you could turn from this still if you want to, Father. I know that, good part of you's in there, that sort of thing. Horus basically says he doesn't actually need the power, but that, he's going to use this power as a tool. And Loken's like, well, you should prove to me that you don't need this power, essentially. Why don't you prove that the old Horus is in there? They continue to argue for a bit. And it's not really going in Loken's favor, unfortunately, at this point. Loken is telling Horus that, the Chaos Gods have deceived him, betrayed him, that he is still a puppet to them, even though Horus insists he's the one in charge, that he is ascendant, that he is all authority and power that the Chaos Gods gave him, that they are simply observers. Horus is convinced of this. And so eventually Loken just sighs and looks down at the broken body of the Emperor and says, he's too far gone. You're right. He cannot be saved. And Horus is like, why are you speaking to him as if, he can answer you at all? And Loken turns and stares back at him and simply says he does have the ability to still fight back to answer you. And this is about the time when the Astronomicon's light reaches Horus and his court, and Horus knows his time is now shorter, that all the Loyalist forces are going to rally around the Astronomicon, lighting the solar system. At this point in time, the Ultramarine fleet and their Primarch is out beyond the solar system, waiting to go in. They couldn't see into it, and this was mentioned at the beginning of the book. They can't see into the solar system at all, so they didn't go in. And then one of the weirdest things that happened to them was that they started detecting the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, but then the ship started multiplying in places, and it was also an 8,000-mile long ship to them, and so they were just seeing it constantly copying itself, essentially, and filling the space of the solar system, essentially showing them that, chaos has suffused the place so much that there is no solar system for now, and so they essentially have to wait to go in. And the Astronomicon breaks this, and time reasserts itself, and all the loyalist forces start making their way into the solar system and making their final push for Terra to relieve it of, its traitor forces. Horus sees this as another ploy of the Emperor, as a stalling tactic, and he's tired of it. He takes his Maul Worldbreaker and he smashes the Emperor's head in. And so you're thinking at this point, okay, what can the Emperor possibly do? He essentially seems to have died here. Loken reapproaches and essentially, starts telling Horus that it's not too late still to relinquish the power. You've accomplished what you wanted to accomplish. You defeated the Emperor. You don't need this power anymore. Prove to all of us that you are this good man that you claim you still are. And so they kind of argue back and forth for a little bit of this, and Horus eventually is convinced. He's like, you're right. I really don't need this. It would be nice to prove to all of you that I am still who I am. And so he relinquishes some of this power. And it kind of falls, it's kind of depicted as falling off of him like black tar around his feet. And that, it's just Horus again for a time here. And Horus starts hearing in the light of the Astronomicon the phrase that the Emperor must live, that Euphrates Keeler was leading the people in the Astronomicon in, and channeling basically their, psychic collective as a focus for the Astronomicon. And Horus realizes he's once again been tricked by the Emperor to some degree, that the Emperor is not dead. He knows he's not dead. And he looks over at Loken, and he realizes that the Loken standing in front of him is not Loken. The one he's been speaking to in this instance was not Loken. Loken is laying on the floor still, where Horus had pushed him over out of the way to smash the Emperor's head in. And Loken's just looking on in kind of either horror or fascination. And then the being standing in front of him, the other Loken, changes into the Emperor again. Once again standing in front of him, having once again deceived his son, and cause him to relinquish part of his power here, enough for the Emperor to take another go at him. And this little paragraph is poignant. I'm just going to read this verbatim. It just says, "He could not fight you alone. He could not beat you alone. But by bluff and ruse and stratagem and sacrifice, he has held your attention until he no longer has to." And then there's this quote by the whispers of essentially the souls of humanity through the Astronomicon. "To be absent in the body is to be present in the Emperor." And it says that a whole species is present here, united in one form, not a man, not a father, but a king of all the ages. And, Horus sees him looking like a god, but a god nonetheless. And there is another whisper that just says, "We are one and the same, mankind and Emperor, Emperor and mankind, souls bound together. We are together as one, or we are nothing." And so this is almost the first depiction of the God Emperor of mankind, right? Where, the faithful have been shoring up the Emperor as well. This is the first depiction of, the cult of the Emperor, the beginning of it with Euphrates, channeling their psychic might into the Emperor to bring him back to enough power to contest with a now weakened Horus. And so this last fight is just kind of this martial, brutal fight. He burns through your nervous system with psychic power, and making Horus feel pain to his core. But then he just brutalizes the Emperor again once more. He crushes the Emperor's windpipe, severing his carotid artery, as well as just brutalizing him horribly. And the Emperor is also giving as good as he's getting. He's also able to, start smashing into the Emperor a bit, but then he breaks the Emperor's wrist, crushes his ribs, and then the blood light goes off again and torches the Emperor's face, and his hair burns, and then one of his cheeks is melted to the bone, and then one eye is burned and bursted as well. And then he uses Worldbreaker to shatter the Emperor's spine once more and hurts the Emperor again. And then the Emperor unleashes one final psionic attack through his remaining eye, blue-white flame. That basically is the channeled souls of humanity coming from the Astronomicon at this point. And it's basically just completely weakening Horus again. And the power's not coming back fast enough from the Chaos Gods to him. And it even says that the Chaos Gods themselves are basically punishing Horus for releasing his power at all that they gave him. That they don't want to give it back to him fast enough at this point. That they're basically seeing him as a failure, and Horus is basically realizing he was indeed a pawn at this point. And whatever's narrating this, says that right now that Horus is, that you are just Horus Lupercal. That's all you are, War Master. That is all you'll ever be, First Found Son. A slave to their darkness, a weapon in their hands, a puppet on their strings, beguiled by their promises and lies, an instrument with no mind of its own, designed to shatter the shield of humanity and tip the human species into the neverness of the warp. And so, on his knees, the Emperor still fixing him with this psychic power. It further says here that the Horus looks up into the Emperor's eyes and sees a simple truth, a secret that should have been kept, despite everything. Some truths are too dangerous to know, or too lethal to hear. That's why the Emperor kept it for 30,000 years. Now you see it too. You see through insurmountable pain everything that has been ruined, and everything that has been betrayed. You cannot ask him for forgiveness. You don't dare, and you can't speak anyway. But you can see it in your eyes. You were too weak to resist them then, and you will be too weak in another moment when they relent and replenish you with their abominable gifts. Your eyes beg him for mercy, a son to his father. End this now. End this. And so, what's interesting is the flow of the power starts going in rapidly, because the Chaos Gods realize that the Emperor does have a method of killing Horus at this point, killing their vessel. And the Emperor pulls out the Anathema blade. And with a psychic voice, the Emperor says, "I wait for you, and I forgive you." And then he drives the blade through the armor into Horus's heart. He channels the full force of his psychic might through the blade, and then it says that there's a fireball flash of its strike, brighter than all of creation. And then Horus gives one last smile, and it's the Horus of old, the Horus from Horus Rising. We get to see his charismatic smile one last time, a smile of relief that he is able to relinquish and be relieved from the Chaos Gods essentially here. And then Horus's head basically dissolves into just his skull, all the flesh disappears, and Horus is gone at this point, with the Emperor basically dying next to him after having this final gambit win out. And so we get basically reality reasserting itself, and the warp and the Chaos Gods all retreat back to the warp with all haste now that their champion is slain. All warp energy leaves. And so reality is basically kind of crunching back into reasserting its own laws into itself. Terra and the solar system all reform themselves. The vengeful spirit untangles itself from being in Terra. The inevitable city, the city of dust that they were in, retreats back into the warp, it says, from where it came. And so that will still play a part later on in the Beckwin trilogy. And it says that even though, at this point, the Loyalists have essentially won, that the reality reasserting itself is also kind of a mini apocalypse. It says that 16 million further people perish just from reality reasserting itself, just from that pure act that happens here. And all the demons are gone suddenly, and so the remaining traitor forces realize, something is incredibly wrong with the situation suddenly, and so most traitors forces know they need to retreat or they're going to be obliterated by reprisal forces that they start seeing in orbit. And Guilliman is currently leading a 8,000 plus fleet of ships, and then more are arriving all the time past him as well. They start arriving in orbit and start instantly targeting enemy ships and taking them down. The Phalanx shows up with the remnants of the solar fleet that's been hiding out near Saturn this entire time. And so they're all fresh, fighting against all the traitor ships that are trying to retreat and get their forces back up onto the ship, essentially. And so the Vengeful Spirit reasserts itself as just a ship again. Rugaldorn and Constantine see everything change from cartilage and bone and flesh to just normal ship decks and things like that as they are making their way closer to the Lupercal court. And they come in to the court and they find Sanguinius and the Emperor and Horus all near each other dead. And they see, Loken in the room and Leto as well. And, actually, Leto isn't known as being there yet. But, so Dorn and Constantine approach the bodies, and they check the Emperor and see that he is still breathing, but he is essentially on his way out, and they know he's dying. And Constantine, you can tell, and his custodies that are with him are just absolutely, you can tell they're devastated for Custodes' sake. They have tears in their eyes, but otherwise they are not reacting emotionally. It just kind of goes to their stoic nature. They essentially can't have much emotion, it seems like, just by their programming. Even if they want to have it, it seems like it's not capable of them. And in fact, a slight digress here, when they're, heading to the court, right before they do that, Constantine looks back the way they came, and several of those custodies show up, and they're like, we made our way here just as you ordered, and we're here now. And that's basically all they do. And it says that Dorn just kind of shakes his head because Dorn expresses in his thoughts that he would have reached out and embraced one of his warriors if they would have, shown up against all the odds like that. And again, it shows that it shows the humanity of Dorn, essentially. These books have made me like Rugaldorn a lot more than I did. He came across a lot more cold and calculating early on, and I think these events kind of changed his character a bit, softened him up a little bit as kind of grateful for brotherhood and things like that, especially when compared to the Custodes. And so Leto first approaches Loken, and Loken is like, you survived, and Leto is like, yes, I did, but I also saw things that I can't explain, how can you explain a chaos god to somebody, So Leto somehow kept his sanity, but, he essentially saw the chaos gods, and he's one of the only beings to see them in any appreciable form that you can see them in. Leto tells Dorn that there's a shrine anteroom on the side, and that Dorn should go there because he believes that the skull Ferrus Manus is in there. So Dorn heads over there, and he does indeed retrieve Ferrus Manus' skull. So he brings it back wrapped in a cloth, retrieved, which is just an interesting little side note. I'm not sure where that skull goes to. I guess maybe back to the Iron Hands. I'm not entirely sure without looking it up. And so they're essentially trying to decide if they're going to move the Emperor and find an embarkation deck and get on a swarm bird there to get back to Terra, get the Emperor back down to the throne, which they learn through some of the cards scattered around. Leto and Loken and Dorn. Even Dorn, who never liked, and expresses here he never liked, psionic, discerning through cards and things like that, this is important here. And it's interesting here because Valder is actually criticizing them for reading the cards. He's basically kind of just emotionally lashing out this entire time. And even, Dorn, of all people, has to correct him and be like, that both the Sigillite and our father use these cards. So, we need to pay attention to these now as well. And they do. And it's basically a last message from the Emperor to essentially take him to the throne. And this entire time the throne has been going out of control. It seems like the throne doesn't need anyone to feed it. If anything, the throne is a power unto its own, and it needs someone to channel its chaotic fury, essentially. Like with the Sigilite basically consumed by it, like it was like burning a giant pillar of flame and melting gold from the ceiling of the throne room by this point. It's just a mess. And it seems like it's actually like unleashing more power, though, not diminishing in power, even though the Sigilite's power is essentially done at this point. So it seems like the Emperor is a focus for it more than, and also the Emperor gains some kind of power from it. But it seems like the Emperor is channeling power through himself with it and isn't gathering it, because I think if he gathers it, he could both come back, but also possibly take too much warp power in again and possibly become the Dark King again. And he wants to avoid that outcome as well. They're eventually able to reach Command, and Command is able to target them with a teleport beacon, so they no longer have to get the Stormbird. So they're targeted and are about to leave. And one thing I'll add as well here is some remaining Blood Angels show up, Raldoron and the rest of them, and they're no longer gripped by the Black Rage anymore. And so they're able to also help as well with getting the Emperor prepared. And the teleport is about to go off, and Loken is near his father's body, near Horus. And they're like, Loken, you need to get, within the beacon's range, come with us. And Loken's like, I'm staying with my father. He has some honor left in him still at the end of everything. And so the rest leave, they get teleported, and Loken is left there alone with the remains of Horus. And then he openly weeps for basically everything he has lost at this point. And it's just kind of Loken is just like, he's such a depiction of everything that was lost represented, essentially. So he's a pretty tragic character at this point, essentially. And things don't get better at this point. So Loken, is waiting there, and eventually he notices some figures, and it's Abaddon and a couple of his Justaerin guard. And the two other Justaerins basically kind of make to, like, they want to fight Loken. But Abaddon is basically like, no, enough fighting. We've done enough of that. There's too few of us left. We should talk. And so Abaddon and Loken talk. And Loken even says, like, there might be a path forward, like with him advocating for them, that, they were fighting on the wrong side, but, like, Abaddon seems willing to possibly be diplomatic here, which is, again, just fascinating to me that Abaddon, tells his men to stand down and talks with a man he originally betrayed, years ago. But both Loken and Abaddon basically came to a similar conclusion that, Horus was foolish in what he did. They both loved him, and they both wish he would have taken a different path. Even if both of Abaddon and Loken disagreed on the paths taken, they both just wish that Horus would have chosen a slightly different path. And they both kind of agreed on that. And so Loken is trying to convince Abaddon to surrender here a bit, and even promises that he will try to advocate for them to actually have honor and have a chance to fight for the Emperor and the Imperium again. Abaddon isn't convinced, and Abaddon even says, like, I don't think that's going to work out, like, I think we need to make a run for it, and you can come with us if you want, actually. And I just find that interesting that Abaddon is basically willing to renew brotherhood with Loken, and Loken is not completely opposed to it. Loken even says, that's fine, but I'm going to continue to try to convince you to do this course of action, and I'm going to do my best to, convince you that not everything's lost. And so it seems like they're going to repair things, and then everyone's favorite cockroach shows up and stabs Loken through the back of the head, and Loken falls into Abaddon's arms. And you really wish that Abaddon would just kill Erebus at this point. But it mentions near the end of this book that, Abaddon knows that Erebus is important, and that Erebus says that Loken had to die. And essentially the reason why Loken had to die was because Loken was the actual birthing of Samus from Horus Rising. It's mentioned several times in this book, and by the name of demons as never born, that they are never born, but they do have a starting and ending point, and they kind of have an eternal cycle that way. And the starting point for Samus is here at this point in time with a very unjust murder at the hands of Erebus. So Erebus still being everyone's favorite punching bag here as well. Abaddon still wants to punch him in the face, even if Abaddon doesn't. And basically we're poised to have Abaddon, become that future leader of chaos, but Abaddon knows better than to allow too much power into himself. He wants to control and not be controlled is the main thing. Like Abaddon was much better at controlling himself and the amount of power he has. So that's why he's not a demon prince or a greater demon or seemingly as much of a puppet to the chaos gods in 40k. He knows the measure of power he can take, it seems like. And then we get, the final scene of, the last bit of Malcador's conscience is still, his mind is still there, and it's just a shard of Malcador left. And we just get Malcador, seeing them bring the Emperor to the throne and, putting him on the throne. But Malcador knows that, while that was a contingency that the Emperor planned for, that it's not the best course of action, and he wishes he could still say something to them about bringing the Emperor to the throne. It seems like maybe there is some hint at, they think they're going to help the Emperor, but maybe they misinterpreted his wishes for being put back on the throne. But that's just kind of conjecture here. And so a couple last things. So I didn't talk about a couple of the subplots just because we're already at an hour and a half for this recording here. And as of right now, my longer videos don't seem to get very many views. So I don't want to people look at this and be like, oh, I'm not going to watch this. They probably already are going to do that at this point. But I had to get my thoughts out for this book because it's such a landmark moment for me personally. One of the subplots I didn't really talk about was Basilio Foe, who was forming a basically essentially a virus that could take out the Primarchs and the Space Marine. Basilio is seemingly killed by Amon, his custody jailer, for trying to escape. And then we do learn that somehow Basilio was able to clone Xanthus' body and take Xanthus' place, actually, is what happened. So Basilio Foe escapes imprisonment, masquerading as one of the chosen of Malcador. And then the Terminus Sanction that he created seems to be sealed away on Titan. So somewhere on Titan is still a virus that can wipe out all Astartes and Primarchs, apparently, somewhere on there. And then it's just left with John Grammaticus traveling back through time, still tying the red yarn to places. And he needs to keep doing that, he thinks, for another few millennia until that task is done for, the Emperor to even have a chance to get to this point to fight Horus, or the entire timeline collapses, apparently. So then the very final scene is Sigismund and Euphrates back at the palace remains. And we have essentially Euphrates only a few miles away from the throne room, but she's not allowed to go in there. And she, kneels before a gigantic depiction of the Emperor, in kind of like in praise and prayer. And she is visibly older now from her ordeal at the Astronomicon. A lot of people were absorbed and burned up by the Astronomicon, but she was simply, it looks like she was aged. Some of her will was taken, but apparently she was spared. And who knows if we're going to see Euphrates again. I don't know if we will during the Scouring or not. Maybe we will. And that is essentially it. Again, this is going to be far from perfect. I just wanted to get my thoughts out there for things that I noticed and liked. Parts of the book that I remember and noticed from my notes and things like that. I highly recommend reading the book yourself if you haven't. and looking at other people's interpretations, I'm sure many people in their videos are going to pick up and add things to this that I just simply didn't put, or, it would have taken a video much longer than this to get everything into this video that I wanted to get into it. But at the core, this is a lot of the things that I liked. And so one of the last things here is Dan's thoughts. He put notes in the end of the book, and he just said a really kind thing to all of us as, lore fans. I'm going to read that paragraph from him. Dan just says right here, Cinderman Strand and the other story threads that it touches reflects what is lost, or what is being lost, the decline towards inhumanity that will characterize the 40K era. Imagination is an irreplaceable human resource. As I said a moment ago, it is the root of magic. Your passionate engagement with the Warhammer 40K universe, your enthusiasm for the lore, your devotion to the magnificently curated armies that you make, and the very fact that you are reading this in any other Black Library book proves you are all adepts. And I just think that's kind of him. Like, you can tell he really respects all of us reading and loving the lore and discussing it, reading any of the books really. And that means all of you as well. All of you with interest in this universe. Dan's thanking all of us that he has the privilege to have put out these books. And I'm sure people are going to criticize and tear apart and call parts of the books bad writing. But I, let the first one of you, without sin, cast the first stone, right? Like, you go ahead and write a better version of this for you, I guess, is what I can say to that. So really, that is it. That's all I'm going to say. I could go on forever about a lot of this stuff. Some speculations at the end here. I mean, the Emperor may or may not have wanted to be put on the throne the way he was. And we don't ever get POE from the Emperor, ever. So we don't get any of his thoughts, motives, what he's ultimately wanting, really. We only hear his thoughts through when he's acting as Loken, and how he feels there. And one of the main things said several times throughout this book is it's not the power that the Emperor has, not the raw power, but how he uses it that's important. The Emperor was able to use the stolen fire or chaos power from the gods to become their anathema, to become their antimatter, to basically cancel them out with his own modified psychic power. And that's what makes him ultimately a true threat to them, is he can, kill parts of them permanently, and he knows how to repurpose their power against them, and can find ways that are devious and often unnoticed to ultimately defeat them. The Emperor is essentially seen as almost less powerful than I expected him to be in this book. He is still powerful, but his ultimate power at the end is deception, really. He deceives Horus into relinquishing enough power for him to kill him with that blade. The old mythology of the Emperor just pulling together his psychic might and obliterating Horus's soul didn't really happen, essentially. It did to an extent, but it only did with the help of the Astronomicon and millions of human souls using their power along with him to do that. But in the original lore, it was just the Emperor alone. And so that might be the myth, depicted that the Emperor needed no one's help, that he did it himself. But the truth of it is, humanity ended up backing him at the end in that last desperate push to push back the darkness and chaos for at least 10,000 years, until we get to the current era where things are back to chaos ascendancy ultimately. But the Emperor also seems to be ascending back to power as well in the current era, and he might be becoming the Dark King. He might be becoming the God Emperor aspect that can walk around. We aren't sure yet there. But they left plenty of mystery here. Again, I kind of want to direct your thoughts to why. The Emperor asking the Chaos Gods, why? I think that's the biggest question I have from this book. Why did the Emperor ask why of the Chaos Gods? Because it seems obvious to us as fans. It seems like the Emperor wanted to strangle essentially the food of the Chaos Gods to a great degree, their power to a great degree, and to, make them essentially weaker or completely kill them off eventually. So the question seems to insinuate the Emperor didn't plan that, but, it makes you wonder, I guess. And again, I could speculate on that one thought forever. And if you do want to keep talking about this, shortly after this video goes live, if you happen to be here this entire time, I will be live for a little while on Battlefleet Gothic Armada. I've been streaming every Friday, and a few of you have shown up, and I like talking with you about the lore there, so we can talk about this lore if you watch this video and then come to the stream, or if you are interested in anything else, I'll answer any questions and discuss anything you'd like. So I'll be live probably I'll be live shortly after this video goes live, essentially. So, when you see this video live, I should be live on the day that it's uploaded, which will be the 9th here today. A little bit later this evening, once I get it put together here a bit better. So as always, thanks a lot for your support so far. This has been awesome to see the level of support this channel is getting. And please consider liking, subscribing. If you've stayed around this long, you might as well. You apparently like to hear me ramble on and on about Warhammer lore. So I would love to see you in the next video if you choose to do so. I'm probably going to put something at the beginning of this video as well as at the end here that I think I'm going to link up the Discord for a limited entry of like a week. So check the description for a Discord link if you want to join me on Discord as well. I do have a server there. So as always, I hope you have a great day or night wherever you are. Thanks again for your support, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Have a great day or night and weekend coming up here. Talk to you soon. Thank you.